So a couple of videos ago, I did a presentation on basic LLC structurings for real estate investors, and we talked about basically how you never want to own real estate in your personal name, that you always wanted to have a couple of buffers between you and your properties. And we talked about having a holding company that in turn owned property entities that in turn owned the properties. And the reason we wanted to have this was in case something happened to you unrelated to the property, car accident, business dispute, you basically owned a holding company as opposed to real estate. And if for whatever reason something happened to the property, sort of an inside attack, they wouldn't be able to get to you because you had both property and holding companies. And so that was kind of the basic of that video. And if you haven't seen it, I will leave a link in the comments below. But one of the comments from that video was, hey, Mauricio, what about us flippers? What if I'm in the business of flipping properties? How do I hold title to those properties? How do I hold title to my S Corp? In other words, if I'm over here doing a flip and have a flipping business, the question is, how do I set that up properly so I maximize not only the asset protection, but also the taxes? So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to go through really three scenarios. The first one is the way that most people set up their flipping business, which is one that I don't usually recommend. Number two is a common proper way of doing it, if you want to say that. And then number three, we're going to talk about the one that I really highly recommend to all of my clients. So without further ado, let's get to it. So what most flippers do is that they create some sort of a flipping entity, and most actually create an S Corp. I personally would actually use an LLC, and then I would talk to your tax professional as to whether that should be taxed as an S Corp or a C Corp or a partnership or disregarded. That's one of the beauties of LLCs, is that you can have it taxed any way you want. But a lot of people use S Corps, and you want to be really careful about S Corps, as my good buddy and fellow legal advisor to McElroy.com, Eric Freeman, talked about a couple of videos ago about some of the pitfalls involved with S Corp. So check with your tax professional as to what's the best tax designation from this LLC. But most people have an entity over here, and they go ahead and do their business. They buy a piece of property, they fix it up, and they then flip it and sell it to an end buyer. And so when they flip it to the end buyer, they no longer own the property, and they go out and they buy a piece of property over here, and eventually they sell it to somebody else. And then, you know, next year they might go ahead and buy a third property and do the flip there. The challenge with this structure, and this is the reason I generally don't recommend this, is that once this property gets sold to a third party, if that third party has any issues with the property, maybe there was some work done. A lot of times flippers are value adding, or they're doing some kind of construction work on the property. If there's any issues with the property that the buyer didn't like, they're going to come after the seller of that property, and that seller is going to be the flipping LLC. And so if the flipping LLC has another property or two properties that it's currently flipping, that's going to be exposed, and most likely the flip is actually going to stop because the attorney is going to reach out, they're going to threaten you with all kinds of liens, and it just causes a huge headache and a real asset protection risk when you have all of your flipping business going on at the same time. Any disputes with third-party buyers, they're going to come back to your flipping LLC, and that's where all the value is. So this is not a structure that I typically would recommend. As usual with asset protection, you want to be separating the liability-producing entity from the valuable assets. And so that's what we're going to talk about in our second option. Now, the second option is vastly better than the first option. And that typically involves having the same flipping entity, again, an LLC, taxed however your tax professional advises you to have it taxed. But instead of owning the properties directly, just like our basic LLC structuring, it actually creates a separate LLC for each of your flips. And so now let's say you buy property number one, you're gonna put that into its own LLC that's owned by the flipping business. It's actually a disregarded entity to the flipping business. And you're gonna go ahead and do your flip. And then when you're ready to sell, you're gonna sell this to the end buyer. And then you're gonna go ahead and shut that LLC down. And that way, when you're going to your next flip, you're gonna create a separate LLC to hold the flip in that second one, and so on and so forth. That way, if something were to happen and the buyer wasn't happy with your work and wanted to go back and sue, it becomes a lot less interesting to a plaintiff's lawyer because that LLC has been long gone, it doesn't exist anymore, and most likely they don't even know who the flipping LLC is. But the fact that there's no LLC makes it really a tough case for a plaintiff's attorney who only gets paid if they recover some money. It's going to be very difficult for a plaintiff to get a plaintiff's attorney to take the case. So generally speaking, you want to be creating an LLC doing your flip and then selling that property, or maybe you're even selling the LLC, but then extinguishing that LLC so that you no longer have that LLC available and it's separate and apart from all of these other entities. Now, even though I like this structure way better than the first, one of the issues that pops up here, which is one of the comments that was brought up in one of the videos, is that, well, what if you decide that on this second flip, for example, you decided to keep it for whatever reason, either you were forced to keep it or you decided, hey, I'm going to hold this property for the long fall, and I'm going to go flip, a third property over here, but I'm going to keep this one. Well, the problem here is that you have an active business over here owning a valuable piece of asset, right? And so if you've kept this and now you're renting it out and doing all this stuff here like a long-term hold, this is a very dangerous business. This is a flipping business that's doing work for all of these, and you want to make sure that if something were to happen to this flipping business, that flipping business doesn't expose your long-term hold. Again, you never want to have your liability-producing entities own anything, and in this case, you would have a liability-producing entity like the flipping company. They would actually own a particular asset. So for that reason, I don't hate the structure, but I would prefer option 3, which we'll get into in a second. So in order to solve my issue at option number 2, I do a slight variation in option number 3, which is still having my LLC over here that gets taxed as an S Corp or a C Corp or a partnership, depending on what your CPA says. But instead of owning the property LLC where you actually hold title to your properties, you're just going to enter into a contract. There's going to be a contractual obligation or a contractual relationship between your flipping LLC and your property LLC, as opposed to a parent and subsidiary relationship. This way, once the property gets sold to a third party, no problem, you'll create a new LLC and you'll do your second and third and fourth flip that way. But if there's ever a situation where you have a property that you want to keep for the long term, renting out, it's going to be in its own property LLC that's going to have nothing to do with your dangerous flipping business, and you're going to be able to treat that just like any of your other properties. And if this was the scenario, what I would eventually do would be then transfer that property LLC, instead of being in your personal name, I would then transfer it to that holding company that we talked about in that prior video, because all of your property LLCs that you hold for the long term generally should be owned by your holding company. And so in this case, if you decide to keep one, great, I would move the ownership to my holding company. And if I decided to flip it, I would just sell it to the third party, and then I would create a new LLC and do my next flip separately. That way we continue to create that separation between the liability producing activity, which is the flipping business, and then the valuable asset, which is the property LLC. And if you want one of your questions answered in a future video, drop a comment below and we'll see you in the next video.